University of Wisconsin. But, I mean, Action's her brother. He's her father. That's her mother. I'm technically her stepfather.
That's weird.
So, I want you all to be exceptionally nice to my child. While she comes up and tells us some things about Action, maybe that you did not know. All right.
Good evening, everyone. So, a couple of years ago, at my mom's funeral, I gave a eulogy that I intended to sort of stop the audience. Because I said, all of you always thought that I was an only child, but I'm not. And I did the whole dramatic pause before I said, I have a younger sister. I think she's a sister name. And her name is the American Council on Science and Health. And so, I like to think of us as sort of Irish twins. I'm not that much older. I was born in July of '77, and Aksha was born in '78. And I really grew up with the American Council on Science and Health as a huge part of my life. This was an honor and a privilege. But like with all siblings, we had our dramas. So I am here to give you kind of like the insider backstory on Action. So, as most siblings do, we helped each other out, right? We siblings help each other out. There was the big ALAR apple scare. Do some people in the audience remember the ALAR apple scare? Well, I'll tell you what. The American Council on Science and Health was at the center of this because they said, no, ALAR is not making people sick. We're in fact destroying the crops of apple farmers. Nothing is wrong. We're creating a disaster where there is none. And a lot of people were writing in, and since this was like still way back when in the days of actual mail, somebody needed to stuff envelopes, lick them, seal them, and stamp them. And that somebody was me. So I have vivid memories in my childhood of sitting in the ACSH offices during the ALAR scare, feeling really, really useful because I was helping science by licking and stamping envelopes. Now, we also helped each other out in different ways. Since I really, in real life, was an only child, and my mother was kind of famous at the time. I mean, she had her own radio show, she was doing all sorts of TV, and what this meant was that there would have been a lot of babysitting. So when I was 8 years old, she decided, in lieu of babysitting, why don't we put Christine on a nationally syndicated radio show to talk about the messages of Action? So there I was. I, at age 8, was the host of No Kidding, a talk show for kids by kids, where I was interviewing, like potentially scientists like you, but from a long time ago, about ACSH health matters. And so, my sister ACSH and I were kind of helping me out because, not every kid in lieu of playdates gets a nationally syndicated radio show. But we did that together. Now, the thing about those siblings is that we also got each other into some trouble. Okay, well, I'll start with the time that I got actually into trouble. So my mom also didn't want to leave me at home when she went on various industry meetings. And there was the time that she was having a meeting with the sugar industry. And I was sitting at the table. I don't remember this, I've only heard this from stories, but apparently I wasn't particularly well behaved. Apparently when the coffee came around at the end of the luncheon, my mother said, yes, I'll take 2 sugars with my coffee. And I piped up and said, really? You never put sugar in your coffee, you only put saccharine. I'm not clear on what happened with funding after that. But then my sister actually got me back. Because when I was 12 years old, my younger sister, she had me going into bars and buying cigarettes from vending machines. She really did. I really did this for the cause of science. Because in New York City, there were these vending machines that were in bars that were totally unmonitored. And anybody, kids included, could go in and buy cigarettes. So my mother, as all good mothers do, sent me into the bar, repeating multiple bars all over Manhattan. And she would give me the dollar bills and I'd feed them into the vending machine. Anyway, I think the end of that ended up with me on a picket line saying, "Philip Morris is a drug dealer. Philip Morris is a drug dealer." This is what all children do, right? At age 12, right? Indeed. There was also wonderful media and hilarious media along the way. When I turned 2 years old, my mother baked me a birthday cake, as mothers do. But most mothers do not get photographed for People magazine for this event, because my mom baked me, wait for it, a cake out of a box. It was out of a box. It was a Betty Crocker cake. And she was claiming to be a scientist, a nutritionist, who was baking a Betty Crocker cake. And somehow this ended up in People magazine, because this was so horrifying in the early 1980s that she was doing something so outrageous as actually using a Betty Crocker cake mix. I am proud to say that I am now the mom of a 3, 5, and 7-year-old, and I only make things that come in cake mix boxes. Go on, go. There were times that we were on television when I was eating dinner because I was so crazy as to eat hot dogs for dinner. I don't know, most of my childhood I thought I was doing like normal kid things, and lots of TV cameras were around because somehow this was scandalous. But my mother always explained to me that people didn't understand the idea of real versus hypothetical risks, and that I should just go along with it. So I just ate my hot dog and ate my brownies and stuff out of the box, and all was well. So my mother was a real media personality. She was on everything from Larry King Live on down, talking about science, talking about real versus hypothetical risks. There was a moment, however, that I still cringe when I talk about, because she turned down Oprah. She didn't want to go to Chicago. Oprah was only filming in Chicago, and my mom was like, "Nah, I'll come in via satellite, but I'm not going to Chicago because I have this other kid." So, Mom really was out there talking about the message of action, which was fantastic because she was really into translational research. She could read all the academic science papers, and then she translated it into talking points, into sound bites, and she wasn't afraid to get in a fight with just about anyone. And boy, did she get into fights with a lot of people on TV. I believe somebody once asked me as a child, "What does your mother do?" And I said, "She yells a lot on television." I mean, now that would be considered normal, I guess, but in the early 1980s, that was an aberration. So there were also some life lessons about growing up with ACSH as a sibling that I want to share with you. The first was one that you all know very well, and is the difference between real and hypothetical risks. But this is one we all need to learn. So for example, I always wear my seatbelt. Like for serious, in the back of taxis, always. Because my mother would always talk to me about how we're worried about trace chemicals in our food. That's not going to hurt us. But driving in a car without a seatbelt, you can be killed. And since we drive in cars all the time, we think, oh, it must be safe. And then we think of these chemicals with these 9-syllable names. Oh, they must be scary. But fortunately, having ACSH in our lives makes us realize the difference between those hypothetical and real risks. So wear your seatbelt when you Uber home tonight. The other famous line in my childhood was, the dose makes the poison. And Hank, thank you so much for putting the real ingredients of tonight's dinner on there, because I have to confess that when I host Thanksgiving, I pull out my mom's Thanksgiving menu and I do the same to all of my guests. I tell them about the cyanide in their mushrooms. That's the one that really gets people, is the cyanide in their mushrooms. They get really concerned about that fact. My mother always taught me about speaking the truth. Speaking the truth about research, right? And she was never afraid. She was distinctly unpopular in a lot of circles, like for serious. But that never deterred her, because she had research, she had science, she had data, and she wasn't afraid to use it. And that was something that passed along to me. So about a week ago, my eldest daughter, Eleanor, who is 7 years old, we have this whole family tradition where every year we make a lot of batches of banana bread. This is the one thing I cook that doesn't include a box, by the way. I make banana bread from scratch, and we did it all together as a family. A lot of it. And we're going to give it to our neighbors, all very sweet. So Eleanor says to me, well, Mommy, I can only have one piece because it's junk food. My back goes up. I say, really, sweetie, why is it junk food? And she says, well, because it tastes good. I see. So then, poor girl, I got to launch into a whole description of how we need everything in moderation. This banana bread tastes good because, yes, it has sugar in it. I'm a big fan of sugar. And so we talked about how all foods give us good energy. And she said, no, but some foods are bad and some foods are good. And I thought, really, Mom? Are you bringing this on just to really steal my resolve into teaching these lessons about how all food is good food, everything in moderation? And I will tell you something about the scope of action in the last 40 years, which is that my mommy friends in my neighborhood, most of whom are medical doctors, they all feed their kids cookies out of a box. They are all happy to have banana bread with a lot of sugar in it. They're all happy to have everything in moderation. And I don't think that was true 40 years ago. I really think now we have this idea, especially among people who know, and this is, as Nan said, this is the idea of being evangelical about this. We can continue to spread the message that everything in moderation, that food is good, and to enjoy life. And this is something that I am really pleased to see that more and more people in my demographic are embracing in a way that really wasn't true 15 or 20 years ago. And I guess I can't speak to 40 years ago because mostly I was eating hot dogs and going on TV for it. So my mother used to say that we need a national psychiatrist. Did any of you ever hear her say that? Yes, I'm seeing some heads nod. That we need a national psychiatrist because we are all so crazy about the difference between real risk and hypothetical risk. The idea of the dose makes the poison. And then we all are willing to ban something at the drop of a rat. Remember my mom's great line about that? Oh, she got good mileage out of it. We're willing to ban something at the drop of a rat. So she always called for a national psychiatrist. And unfortunately, I did not go into medicine enough to myself become a psychiatrist. But I do study well-being and the choices we make to kind of maximize our well-being. So I studied meaning and purpose formation among young adults and really through the life course. So what matters most to us? Why does it matter? And then how do we make it happen in our lives? And one of my favorite slides to show to my 18 and 19-year-old students at the University of Wisconsin is a slide that talks about the new definition of a billionaire. And in the new definition of a billionaire is someone who has positively impacted the lives of more than 1 billion people. And I show that quote on the back of a slide of a field of wheat. And then I ask my students, why am I putting that quote on a slide of a field of wheat? No one can ever answer it. But it's the perfect tee-up to talk about Dr. Norman Borlaug, because he, as a food scientist, saved the lives of more than 1 billion people when he made a strain of germ-resistant wheat. And this is the power of what food science can do. This is the power of the message of action. And so I kind of carry that on in the idea of helping young adults find their purpose, their calling. Because not all of us will save the lives of 1 billion people or more. But we can all try to embrace science toward the greater good of the world. I now study the self-help industry, which is a bastion of all things crazy. I've studied it for nearly 20 years, about what works and what doesn't in self-help. And what I'm particularly interested in with the self-help industry is where science and self-help interact, and where they also kind of come into conflict in a huge way. So when we think of self-help, we often think of alternative medicine, we think of crazy esoteric practices and things like that. Well, now there's some really interesting research that's being done in extreme self-help that is joining the idea of science and research with well-being, whether it be the use of psychedelics as an antidepressant treatment, whether it be hypothermia and heat as a way of boosting mood. These are all things that are on absolutely the fringes and can totally be co-opted to be total junk science. But at the core of them, there may actually be real data. And so in my next phase in my career, I feel like I'm very much carrying on my mom's work by trying to separate the hype from the research and seeing where those good nuggets can come to really help people in terms of boosting their well-being. So there's been tons of progress in the last 40 years. Think about it. How many people do you know smoke? Right? I mean, like, none of my friends smoke. And 40 years ago, a lot of people smoked. Now, I won't attribute that single-handedly to the American Council on Science and Health, but I'll tell you, my mom did write a lot of books about it. She wrote more than 27 books, many of which were about smoking. And my first full sentence, swear to God, my first full sentence was not like, "Mama, I love you." It was, "Smoking is dangerous." So I was a proponent of the action message early on. Seatbelts. We usually wear them these days. We're pretty good about it these days. 40 years ago, I think, as I'm talking to my other friends about their childhood, they were like rolling around in the back of a, minivan, with no seatbelts at all. So these are, seatbelts and smoking, right there, are two preventative measures that we can take to really impact our health and longevity. As I said, the doctor moms I know are sensible about their nutrition in a way that I don't think existed in the past. These messages of balanced science are getting out there. So my challenge to you guys in the next 40 years, and there will be a next 40 years, because let me tell you, when I turned 40, I'm not much older than Aksha. I'll remind you of that again. When I turned 40, I told everybody that 40 was old enough to be taken seriously, but young enough to reinvent yourself. So for the next 40 years of action, my hope is that you're not afraid of speaking the truth about science, right? That you fight this good fight, you keep going. Big fears, little risks. Let's take those fears and sort of mush them down into little schmooze and talk about the real risks and how we can together address them. And as my mother would say, just because it's not popular doesn't mean it's not true. So all of you here together are a vote of confidence for real science. And I am so honored to be here with you. My mother is right here in spirit. And she is so pleased to see all of you here celebrating her life's work and celebrating my little sister, the American Council on Science and Health. So happy birthday. If I had a glass, I would raise a glass, but happy birthday to the American Council on Science and Health. And here's to the next 40 years.
Thank you, Dr. Lewin. You mentioned this holiday menu, which has the toxic